Say again? Maybe. Color coordinated. No. All right. They're going to force me to do like I do in my classroom to go to do that kind of thing, to get started. But this is the opportunity I could give my father-in-law a really hard time. And he would do that to me. He would say something, crass like, "Sit down." The gentleman in the blue. All right, y'all, we got to get started. So, yeah, we got to get going. Hey, Brian and Jimbo, we got to get going. This segment is brought to you by Beltone. They're not able to hear today. Yeah. All right. So, as you may know, Christian Lightheart was unable to be here. And one of the things that he did, I should have known better when he called me and said, "Could you guys handle this without us?" I said, maybe. What are you asking? And anyway, one of the things was he had reached out and talked with Michael and Donald and folks about speaking at this thing, and I missed that. And so we scrambled to get to make good on that there with Donald to get him back in here, and so I'm glad we did. And you guys traveled the farthest to get here by car. Crawford's, I guess, by car to get here for the music camp, and y'all for the psalm tap. But please help me welcome Donald Owens as he talks about metrical psalm making.
I think the title in your handout is Writing Metrical Psalms. It's actually a little longer than that. The ideals and methods. I'm not going to do a class on how to write metrical psalms. Ideals and methods of writing metrical psalms, and the subtitle would be We Can Do Better. I'm going to begin just with a question that comes to my mind because it's often been given to me. There are only 150 psalms. Why do we need more? We have many. Every single one of the psalms has been versified multiple times. Why do we need more metrical psalms? And there have been some good supports given through composed psalms, which I was convinced by. I love. There are a lot of different ways to do it, chanting and other ways, but this is one that's not going away. Why would we go on writing metrical psalms? I have a couple things that come to my mind. Nothing about this whole talk is exhaustive, or it would be exhausting, probably more to me than to you. So why do we need more? First of all, we don't need any reasons. It's just fun. Here, listen to what I just wrote. It's fun. And to quote Dr. Seuss, if you never did, you should. These things are fun, and fun is good. So I think that's a valid reason. Secondly, the language changes. Over time, our language, like it or not, dictionary or not, our language changes, and it's by design. I think we should like it. It's not to be regretted. As Jim Jordan said in Through New Eyes, because God has ordained that men will grow, whether they want to or not, men always outgrow their symbols. We can never outgrow God's symbols, but we do outgrow our own. To attempt to return to earlier symbols without recasting them is a rejection of maturity. And although that had another application in that book, I think the same is true with any man-made attempt to portray what God was doing. We are not going to graduate to another Bible, but we will graduate to better ways, newer ways of saying it, and updated ways of saying what it says. So, with apologies to the RPCNA, my brethren, we can do better than ending Psalm 137 by dinging wee bairns on the craggy. So that's a good reason. Thirdly, there are tunes that need words. The Becker Psalms, for instance, were in German, but the tunes deserve to be sung. And that I'm only aware of that because I'm not much of a musician, because my brother kept asking me to write some for that. Also, there are some settings where the tune and mood is such a mismatch that it's sometimes better just scrap the whole thing and start over with a tune that works well and get words for it. So that I think there's another good reason. Another reason that I think it's worthwhile effort is the same reason we need new sermons. To say the same thing from a new angle. Like Chesterton's character in Man Alive, creeping across rooftops, steals in through the attic window, and takes some of that food and kisses that woman, and it's his own family, it's his own house. To see it from a new perspective. And I think psalm settings allow us to creep in through the attic window and spy on old truths freshly. And fifthly, many of those that do exist are embarrassing. Many of those who have set their hand to psalm versification seem to have taken to heart Chesterton's famous quip, if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And apparently they found psalm versifications worth doing. Sometimes the tune says something different than the words. Sometimes the ideas are imported or completely left out. Often the unpleasant bits are left out. Sometimes they're left out just because they didn't fit in the tune, which, I understand. Writing metrical psalms is hard. But this is where I really want to park for this talk. There is no excuse for bad psalms anymore. We must write better ones. We must abandon the doggerel. We must understand the mood or range of moods expressed in a psalm, choose music consistent with that, and write good poetry, good English poetry. So a lot of attention is being put into music, and that's good. It needed it, and it's benefiting. But we need to not settle for mediocrity in our lyrics either. It's very, very important to me. So that's what I'm here to try to get across to you. So what are the ideals? What is my goal? And then if we have time, maybe a little bit about method, but mainly the ideals. Here's what we're aiming for. What is the goal of writing metrical psalms? Metrical psalms are, one, genuinely good English poetry. We cannot settle for less than that. There's no reason to settle for less than that. Many people think that there is a good reason to settle for less, and I'll get to that. Secondly, as close to a faithful translation as possible. Again, something that is not on the radar of many people as not possible, so why bother? I'm here to say that it's a lot more possible than you might assume. I do not believe we have to choose between theologically precise doggerel and beautiful English heterodoxy. I don't think those are our choices. Unfortunately, many metrical psalms fall somewhere in between anyway. So genuinely good English poetry, and I think it's essential. C.S. Lewis said most emphatically, and not that I'm recommending his book on the Psalms, unfortunately, one of the few of his I'm not really a fan of. But he did say, most emphatically, the Psalms must be read as poems, as lyrics, with all the licenses and all the formalities, the hyperboles, the emotional rather than logical connections, which are proper to lyric poetry. They must be read as poetry if they are to be understood. Otherwise, we shall miss what is in them and think we see what is not. And I think that's a valid point. It could be adjusted maybe, but I'll leave it alone. And I think this is true in Hebrew poetry, and I think it's also true in English. If we do not read it as poetry, if we just make it another creed that we sing aloud, we're missing something that the original audience would have experienced. We should experience poetry when we sing it, and poetry is more than simply true facts. A lot has been written on the subject. What is good poetry? And by the way, as I speak of high quality poetry, I want to distinguish that from highbrow poetry. I'm not talking about, well, I can't give you a list of poets because they don't come to mind right now, but I'm talking about more folk level, hymn level is probably the best place to go. There are a lot of really, really sound hymns that could be read and not sung to profit. you would sit down and read the well-crafted hymns that have been around for a long time as poetry for their own sake and be edified and not be turned off or confused by the style. And the Psalms of all Christian music have been criticized for being doggerel, for being bad poetry. And we've earned it, and we shouldn't. There are a lot of different directions we could go in defining good poetry. There's something that I've been aiming for as I've written poetry, not being trained formally on it, except by my parents. But something that I've been aiming for that Peter Leithart expressed and resonated with me in Credenda Agenda back in 2010. Poetry exploits the musical qualities of language. That means in part exploiting the oral qualities of language, its rhythms, repetitions, alliterations, and assonances. Poetry is supposed to sound luscious, and I underline that. Poetry is supposed to sound luscious. I think this is true. I think this is what we're aiming for. This is, at least for me, what I like about a poem and what I try to write in a poem. It's supposed to sound luscious. Poetry, therefore, is made by those who love their language. I think that's very important too. We have to get over our bias against English. More on that later as well. Pastor Leithart went on, but it also means that poetry aims to exploit the transcendent qualities of language, the evocative and emotional qualities that make it stretch beyond the direct referent and strain toward musical. What I love, that's what I love about the writings of people like Ray Bradbury, who often use the technically wrong word or phrases that do not have a clinically definable referent, but they express more deeply because of that. That's what I love. Now, of course, this is limited. We could say this about poetry generally, maybe. In writing Psalms, we have a very specific set of guidelines. We're in a specific genre with its own unique constraints, and that's true. But at first, we have to understand something about good poetry. And that's what I'm aiming for. Poetry that sounds luscious, that is more than simply prose. Would you read it for pleasure? I think that's a fair question to ask when you're analyzing a metrical psalm. Poetry loves constraints. I think that was referred to yesterday a couple times, or last night. Poetry loves constraints. In addition to the standard poetic constraints of rhyme and meter and rhythm and rhyme, I'm going to insist on, and there may be many arguments on why that's not important. It's one of the constraints that I think has been a tradition in English poetry, that's a good tradition, and it's one of the restraints that those who love English will probably always try to conform to. And I think just because of our poetic tradition in English, if we settle for one that does not have end rhymes, somebody's going to rewrite it at some point. Somebody's going to keep trying to rewrite it, because that will not satisfy a large portion of poets. Now, there's such thing as jingoistic rhymes, and you want to avoid a silly kind of rhyming, predictable rhyming. But I think we ought to aim for good rhymes. So what is good poetry for congregational singing? In addition to rhythm, rhyme, meter, we are limited by a tune. We're limited by congregational accessibility, I believe, and I'll get to that in a minute. And we're limited by not getting to choose our own themes and our own imagery, which is sometimes very frustrating, because lots of times ideas will come into my mind as I'm trying to write a metrical psalm, and that's not my job. What is good poetry? I would recommend, by the way, a small book called The Anatomy of Hymnody by Austin Lovelace. There's a thorough introduction to the topic of hymnody, but a lot of his ideas translate well into this subject of psalmody. Here, just to, and I was going to write it on the board. Some of them are too long. It's just, I have been teaching with a board for a long time, so it's not instinctive to me. But here are my goals for writing poetry. Specifically, this kind: a fixed meter and syllable pattern. And these are in order of priority for me when I'm writing one. Fixed meter and syllable pattern is non-negotiable. If I can't reach that, I scrap it. Somebody else will do better than me. Natural word order. This is very important to me. It can be inverted for emphasis only, but to have an inverted word order to fit the meter is lazy. It's not necessary, and should be avoided. End of line rhymes is one of the things that is one of my essential things, and it should be that could be broadly defined. It could be, there are a variety of kinds of rhymes, but end of line rhymes is important. Stanzas which express a complete thought and exhibit good movement. This is one of the things that's not necessary in poetry that won't be sung. It's in fact, I think it's beautiful when a thought flows over into the next line in poetry. But I do not think that works well for this, what we're doing here. A complete thought, and that's a constraint. That restricts what we can do. But again, poetry loves constraints. Fifthly, striking memorable phrases throughout. And to be beautiful poetry, it has to be striking. It has to be something that you're glad you read, and that if you love English, it'll resonate with you. And then 3 more that are preferred. So those are the goals that are, for me, non-negotiable. I'm going to scrap it or write back if Michael was asking for one and say I couldn't do it if I can't reach those goals. But then there are preferred ones that I'm also aiming for, but I can negotiate on. No wasted syllables. Every word must count. I don't want a whole line of padding just to get the words where I want them. I fill it with filler. Every word to count. Second, preferred solid Anglo-Saxon words. I think it's easier to make poetry with Latin words, with words that end with tion. There's so many of them, and it's easy to rhyme. But the more solid Anglo-Saxon words that you can get, something that you would find in Beowulf, the more visceral it'll be to English speakers. And then finally, plainer, more direct construction is preferred. Someone quoted Tween yesterday. Don't use a $5 word if a 50-cent word will do. And that's exactly what I would say. Plainer, more direct construction preferred. With the Psalms, we don't have the liberty of topic or imagery selection, but we must still write poetry. English, it sounds luscious. We can do better hymns, possibly, but I would argue we already have a much higher standard for hymns than we have for Psalms right now. And I don't think that should be. I didn't write down what psalm this is from. Somebody may recognize it. But here's a quote from a psalm. Do you know which one it is? From thy spirit, Lord, whither shall I go? 139, these contractions that make no sense. Or from thy presence flee. Ascend to heaven, lo, thou art there. There if in hell I lie. Take I thy morning wings, and dwell in utmost parts of sea. E'en there, Lord, shall thy hand me lead. Thy right hand hold shall me. If this were a hymn, it would never have seen the light of day, right? But because it's a psalm, it's been printed and used. Hey, it's good enough, right? We're at least we're singing the Psalms. But are we? The Psalms are outstanding poetry. That's not outstanding poetry. We should experience outstanding poetry when we sing the Psalms. Our children should experience outstanding poetry when they sing the Psalms. The Jews' experience would have been very different, right? The original was outstanding. Someone said also yesterday that it's, Dr. Hodges, I think, doesn't matter what kind of music it is, people will say, so long as the words are biblical. Those people do not understand music. And I would say the same thing about poetry. If we're saying it doesn't matter what kind of poetry it is, as long as all the main concepts are there, we don't understand poetry. And if you don't understand poetry, that's fine. Leave the metrical psalm writing to those that do. So again, this means love English. Good poetry is written by people who love their language. I promise not to turn into a sermon, but 1 Corinthians, well, I don't promise it. 1 Corinthians 14:10, on the subject of the corporate assembly, says, well, starting in verse 9, so likewise you, unless you utter by the tongue words easy to understand, how will it be known what is spoken? For you will be speaking into the air. There are, it may be, so many kinds of languages in the world, and none of them is without significance. Now, none of them is without significance does not mean that they're all valued. This is not cultural egalitarianism. All the languages are just as good to me. I affirm you, Swahili, you are good. This is rather a denial of linguistic subjectivism, if that's the right term. That the idea is, significance here is actually translating another word that's usually translated other places as mute. All the languages, in other words, communicate something. They say something. They are used to express ideas. Language is capable of communicating meaning. When I speak, I take ideas out of my head and transfer them into your head, and now you have an idea in your head that you didn't have there before, that came from somebody else. It did not originate from you. This should go without saying, but these days, of course, it can't. Paul says further, none of them is mute. None of these languages are non-signifying. So I guess the way I'm applying this here is that we should not say that English is a non-signifying language. We can't do it in English. They did it in Hebrew, but this isn't Hebrew, this is English. This is a mutt of a language. No languages are non-signifying. They all can be used to communicate what needs to be communicated. It is popular to dislike English, for internet meme writers to compile a list of homophones as though that change is a charge against my mother tongue, as though she would be better off made of stainless steel gears and cogs like Latin, humming along like a sterile communication machine. That's not English. Leave my mother alone, right? My mother tongue has fingerprints and lots of aunts and uncles and adopted grandfathers. She has her, I probably shouldn't have used a mother metaphor. She has her feet in Old Norse dirt, the dough of German bread still on her hands, and the foam of Anglo-Saxon beer still clings to her sleeve. Maybe Italian poetry is what it takes to satisfy poetic snobs, but my heart speaks English. And I want to sing the songs of the kings with my heart. Good poetry is written by those who love their language. If you do not love English, hands off. So to write poetry, I will try to hang out with people who love English. I try to read Beowulf at least annually, preferably Seamus Heaney's translation. I always have a book of poetry by my bed. I try not to let too much time elapse without reading something by G.K. Chesterton, Nate Wilson, others who know how to be creative, to use good, solid imagery. And I regularly return to certain writers like Ray Bradbury. This expands my word hoard and also helps me expand the usefulness of the words that are already stockpiled. But, back to 1 Corinthians 14, and this is important, it must be translated properly. It is important that it be translated. And Paul argues that it's important that when a prophecy is given to the church or someone is speaking in a tongue, there must be an interpreter, right? But it's actually Paul's main point in the passage that it must be translated properly. Culminates in verse 28. If there is no interpreter, what is an interpreter? Someone who can give the true meaning of what was given. Let him keep silent in church, and let him speak to himself and to God. The work of translation must be done, or it's better to be silent. Even if God himself has given the revelation to his church, if there is no interpreter, shut up. That's a pretty serious command. I don't think the Reformed have always taken this as seriously as they should. If it isn't good, don't sing it. If it doesn't scan, it doesn't sing. I was at an Amish wedding for the first time last summer. I was invited by an employee of ours who was getting married, and this is my first experience with Amish music, with Amish singing, which is just fascinating. If you can ever go on YouTube and look up Amish singing and just see what they do, it's unbelievable, especially if you can see the words going along with it in German. But the thing that fascinated me was everyone could sing it. All the men sit on this side facing that side of the room, the women sit on this side facing the men. And they're singing with only words, these very complicated tunes that they've handed down. And one of the guys sitting next to me that I was friends with, who's Amish, afterward, I was listening to the German, High German sermons, and I could always tell what scripture he's reading from. Could always tell the sort of themes that he's talking about, because German and English are so similar, although I don't have any German. And I asked him about it. He said, wow, that's amazing, you could pick that up. I said, do you follow it? And he said, well, kind of, mostly. We had to learn it in school. And it struck me as the end of the road of those who continue to sing the Scottish Psalms or something. In 200 years, do we want our children to scratch their heads and say, I don't know most of what we say? That's disobedient to Paul. So I love old Scottish brogue, but I don't believe it belongs in worship because it's not my language. It's not translated into the vernacular. So that brings me to the next goal, and I think I have time. So good English poetry, we must insist on. Secondly, a faithful translation. Is this even possible? Many people don't think so. And reading Don Quixote to my daughter recently, we ran across this quote from the fellow in that humorous library purging scene, where he's throwing books out the window because they're afraid that these books are what led to Don Quixote's snapping. And he says this of a book of poems that had been translated into Spanish. He says, I could willingly have excused the good captain who translated it that trouble of attempting to make him speak Spanish, for he has deprived him of a great deal of his primitive graces. Misfortune incident to all those who presume to translate verses, since their utmost wit and industry can never enable them to preserve the native beauties and genius that shone in the original. And I think this is an attitude that many people have, that no matter how genius you are, you cannot preserve the native beauties and genius in translating poetry. Now, I will, and I don't want to, but I will grant that there is some truth to that. You can't do the entire thing. There will be something lost, okay? But we can do far, far better than we're doing. A much, much higher value, and we should insist on a much higher level of translating the original, I believe, than many of the ones I'm seeing. And I just want to also, all the criticism that I'm leveling is not against everything that's out there. I've been seeing great stuff these last few days, and I've been singing great stuff for the last few years. There is a lot of good out there. So don't take me as saying, I'm going to write it all from now on. There's a lot of good stuff out there. But there's also a lot that we have allowed in that I don't think we need to, in future hymnals, be allowing, future psalters. I think this attitude is one of the main problems that I've run across anyway, that it's not a translation, right? It's not Hebrew, it's not a translation, it's good enough. We got the right number of syllables, we approximated some content. We can't do any better, right? That's the objection that I get. It's just the best we can. We approximate the psalm to the right number of syllables, usually. We butcher out excess syllables with forced contractions. We stick a tune to it, and we start singing, and we say, it's the best we can do. It's not a translation. I was about to say fair enough. I don't think it is fair enough. It's not a translation, but we ought to do the work of a translator when we're writing psalms. I think we ought to know something about translating, and we ought to be trying. We ought to be aiming for that. Wouldn't it be cool if we could? So that's what we should be aiming for. That's a goal of mine. Let me, this is what I do. Let me show you. This is one we sang earlier, Psalm 109. When I'm writing a versification, I take the psalm and run it down one side, and another column I start working on my own. And then I have the rhyme and the stressing and everything that I need to know what kind of poetry it is and how it'll fit into the music. And I'll explain that more at the end if I have time. So I'm constantly back and forth, comparing. And so that's what I have in my notes here. And so I'm just going to compare a psalm from the Psalter Hymnal 1987, the New King James, and their versification. Listen to the power of Psalm 105:31. He spoke, and there came swarms of flies and lice in all their territory. And that becomes, God spoke, and horseflies swarmed ahead. Verses 32 through 34. He gave them hail for rain, and flaming fire in their land. He struck their vines also, and their fig trees, and splintered the trees of their territory. Becomes hail raining down instead of bread. What is that? Is it some sort of reference to manna? That's not in the original at all, and it's not clear, and it does not reflect what's there. 34 and 35, he spoke, and locusts came, young locusts without number, and ate up all the vegetation in their land, and devoured the fruit of their ground. Becomes grasshoppers hopped, increasing dread. Am I supposed to feel increasing dread? Or what are you telling me? 36, he also destroyed all the firstborn in their land, the first of all their strength. That's solemn. You feel that. God killed their firstborn sons all dead. Something is lost in translation, and we can't just excuse this as it's the best we can do. I've seen better, so I know that's not true. Now, it's true that imposing the constraints of English metrical poetry will eliminate certain word choices that a straight prose translation would have suggested. But come on, this kind of stuff should not be published. We can do better. Picture it this way. A ruby looks great rough. I mean, I would take one, right? They're pretty. I would pick it up if I found it, if I didn't know what it was. But it needs the constraints of mathematically precise facets to truly shine. right? The restraints of order and precision do not smother the essence of the original. They release it. In The Shepherd's Castle, George MacDonald's protagonist describes his poetry writing this way: "The labor is in getting the husks of expression cleared off the thought so that it may show for what it is." And that is a poet's goal. The problem is that with a gemstone, this is accomplished by cutting off the excess, right? And we're dealing with Scripture. We're not one jot or tittle is excess. So the question is, can we change the picture a little bit to, is the gemstone malleable enough that instead of chipping anything off, we can press it into the English poetry mold? That's the job before us, in any case, I would say. Without whittling off anything we would call excess, can we press it into the mold of English poetry? At the very least, in addition to the rules of English poetry, I think we also need these four things. And again, this is not a list I came up with on my own. This is a list that was through conversations with my brother and with some other people that I consulted with in my earlier attempts at poetry. Four things that we're aiming to reproduce in doing English metrical psalms: the abstract content of the psalm, the overall structure of the psalm, and most of them barely get the first one right. Well, not most of them, but there are many that barely get the first one right. But we need to aim for higher. The overall structure of the psalm should somehow be reflected. The concrete imagery of the psalm is what makes it poetry in some ways, makes it grip you. And the peculiar repetitions of the psalm. We need to pay attention to things like that. There may be more, but this is, for me, again, this is not exhaustive. This is the list that I have that when I'm writing psalms, I aim for. So, this brings me to my third point, methods. I wasn't sure I would get to it, but I'll just outline a little bit of what I do to try to come up with psalms, not because I'm this highly trained expert who can enlighten, but because I've been working on it for a while. I really enjoy doing it, and I have a couple more minutes to fill. Habits, and I think this is important. Me personally, I cannot just sit down after a month of, I'm a general manager at a construction company. It's about as far from poetry as you can be. And I can't just, after 2 months of that, just start writing poetry, unless I've been doing other things in my life to keep it fresh. So read well. I referred to this earlier. Read well, read the stuff that you want to imitate. Read the stuff that stirs up the juices. Read poetry. I keep it by my bed. I would say choose a weekly minimum that you'll be reading. Read diversely. Read all kinds of poetry, even poetry that would not work well, even poetry that isn't metrical. Read poetry. Read about poetry. I've read books on writing poetry, on revising poetry, on the history of poetry, on specific kinds of poetry. I've worked on learning the terminology of poetry, the iamb and the trochee and the anapest and the dactyl. Practice writing in different forms, tetrameter, pentameter, hexameter, heptameter, etc. Now, granted, a week or a month later, maybe all that's left in my mind is some have 2 feet, some have 4, some have 6 feet, some have more, to quote Dr. Seuss again. But that's fine, because ultimately, language is only alive on the tongue and in the heart. The rules are more like observations of what works. If you simply write by the rules, which you must do when you're learning anything, follow the rules to the T, they are like laws of nature. They're not prescriptive, they're descriptive. This is what we see working well, and so we make a list. But the good poets don't simply check off a list. I did it there, now it's poetry. You need to learn them. They need to become instinctive to you. They need to jiggle down inside and settle where they settle and make you into a poet. So become familiar with this stuff. And then the steps. My psalm settings, I have to admit, don't always live up to my standards. And I don't want you to say, oh, Donald wrote some in the New Psalter, let's go see if he kept all his own rules. I mean, you're free to do that, but I'm not always happy with what I find when I do that. These what I'm trying to outline are what I'm aiming for. Being post-millennial, I happily anticipate the day when every one of the things that I've done will be superseded by much, much more valuable poetry that'll take your breath away. But I'd rather that be sooner than later. So I'd like to set a high bar. So I start. Here's just simply what I do. First thing I do when I'm sitting down to write a psalm, a metrical psalm, is I read over these rules again. Fixed meter and syllable pattern, natural word order, end of line rhymes, stanzas which express a complete thought and exhibit good movement, striking memorable phrases throughout, preferably no wasted syllables, solid Anglo-Saxon, plainer and more direct is preferred. Then I read and reread the psalm. Okay, I put the poetry aside, and I was a pastor for 9 years. I have some experience with preparing a sermon. I just do the same thing I would do if I was going to preach a sermon. I read it over and over and over again until I can express what it's saying in my own words. Sometimes I'll even write an outline if it helps, but the goal is to be able to hold the thought of it in your head, to understand the psalm and be able to say what it's saying out of your head. Then I move on to the third step. I listen to whatever tune I'm writing for. Sometimes that has involved choosing some tunes, now that I understand the psalm as well as I can, choosing a tune that seems to express something. But often I've been just assigned a tune, which I prefer, not being much of a musician. And then once I have that, then I put the syllable emphasis on the top of the page so that I know what I'm working through. I just write it out so I know what syllables should be stressed. Then I segment the psalm into its natural divisions. I work through what would work in stanzas. Try to work from that to figure out how much I will put in each stanza, so the divisions are natural as you're singing and you don't stop in the middle of a thought. Then I block it in without any concern for proper English, for stressing, for rhyming, but making sure all the keywords are included and all the syllable count is correct. That way I know if one of the concepts really needs a certain word, that I'm going to need to use that word somewhere, and I'll have to fit some other stuff around that word, or if I'm going to have to find an alternative. And then that's when the real work begins. All of that doesn't take that long, but the real work is the editing. And then it just comes down to editing. To quote Donald from George MacDonald's Shepherd's Castle again, there, he said, if you will go over these, handing her a book of poetry he had written to prove it was really his. If you will go over these, you will see hardly the poem as you may have read it, but the process of its growth. First you will see it blocked out rather roughly, then clean at first, but afterwards scored and scored. Above you will see the words I chose instead of the first, and afterwards again rejected, till at last I reach those I let stand. That's something like what happens as I edit. And if I could print out the entire document, you'd see pages of all different colors, because one of the things that writers will say, and most of the books I've read on writing well, is kill your darlings, right? You have to be willing to take your favorite little sparkling bit of English, and it doesn't work, and get rid of it, and not insist on it. but I can't. So I just move them down, and maybe I'll use them some other time or read over them for pleasure, but they won't work with this setting, so I just have these pages of alternates. And it's just editing. From there, it's just editing. And I don't know that there's a whole lot more that I can add. You'll either stick with it until it's good, or you'll abandon the project and start over. But my appeal here is whatever you do, please don't just settle. If you get stuck and you can't make it sparkle, then give it up. There are many other people. You don't have to be the one. Somebody will do it right. There's one thing the world doesn't need, and it's another mediocre psalm setting. And I can't help, again, but end on a post-millennial note. Somebody is going to get it right. Someone is going to realize it was possible to have good English poetry and a good translation in one setting. And if that's not you, that's fine. But don't distract us with more doggerel. Thank you.
Questions and get coffee and more treats.
Actually, Jared, do you mind if we sing one song since we have
Sure.
like 3 minutes?
Let's do it.
Turn to 296. If you have your. I'm going to line this out so you actually don't even need to look at the words, but I just want to have a chance to sing some of these. Extol the Lord, give honor. Extol the Lord, give honor. Employ new songs and sing. Employ new songs and sing. Sing praise with saints in concert. Sing praise with saints in concert. Let Israel praise their King. Let Israel praise their King. Adoring God who made them. Adoring God who made them. Let Zion's sons rejoice. Let Zion's sons rejoice. Let dancing joy pervade them. Let dancing joy pervade them. With timbrel, harp, and voice. With timbrel, harp, and voice. Verse 2, straight through. The Lord approves his nation, he beautifies the meek by granting them salvation. Let saints in glory speak, let those in bed sing loudly, the praise of God is grand. With mouths that praise him boldly, and two-edged swords in hand. Verse 3, we're getting it. For full retaliation, to judge the people's sins, to punish every nation, and bind the kings with chains, those rich with iron fetters, to judge them by his word. All saints will share this honor, and thus we praise the Lord. Let's do the last line again. All saints will share this honor, and thus we praise the